Everybody, we'll get started. My name is Catherine Cook. I'm a Senior Associate in the Employment Team. Thank you so much for coming along today. We are going to be diving into an introduction for neurodiversity at work. It is, in part, I'm rerunning this since it's a Neurodiversity Celebration Week this week. And as part of that, we thought we would rerun a talk I originally did at the end of last year. Neurodiversity continues to be a growing subject. It's certainly something which is coming up quite a lot in my day-to-day practice, that of my colleagues, and it's certainly something the employment tribunals are seeing more of. So it is a topic that we are trying to support our clients to become educated on, to the positives and risks attached to having a neurodivergent employee and how best to support them at work. I have to say that this is an absolutely massive topic. This is going to be a very whistle-stop tour, and if anybody is interested in further additional training for their managers, which would include a detailed look at the case law, some speaking exercises and tasks to go through, as well as a bit more, as I say, in-depth knowledge about the different types of conditions and practical issues that might come up, then please let me know. I do have a longer version of this talk which can be delivered to management, and let me know and I'll give you a quote. So, it is estimated that about 1 in 7 people in the UK is neurodivergent. That's a figure I've got from the Donaldson Trust from 2024. It can be a hugely positive thing to have a neurodiverse employee. I do have clients whose type of work they do tends to attract employees who are neurodiverse. And again, some of the feedback from them has been, well, actually, the kind of instructions I give to, for example, my employee who I know is autistic, they follow that instruction to the absolute letter, and I know they will do a really key and thorough job on whatever I ask them to do. But it can also be a cause of conflict. So again, perhaps where somebody might be overly wedded to a process and therefore won't have the flexibility to depart from that process when needs be, that can sometimes cause conflict in the workplace. And again, that's something we need to be alive to and need to be something to manage. And likewise, there are very tricky scenarios that we come across as well. So perhaps the employee might have been diagnosed early, received support at school, has quite a good understanding of their condition, and has had support over several years, and might be, perhaps a younger person, with historically diagnosis going up in school, schools more alive to these issues. Equally, you might have a later in life employee who's only just had a recent diagnosis, and certainly we're seeing an increase in middle-aged people being diagnosed with ADHD, for example, or indeed people having a little light bulb moment where their child might receive a diagnosis and looking at other members of their family and themselves and going, oh, hang on a minute, is there something that I need to be looking into here as well? And sometimes there are people who you might suspect might be neurodiverse, but don't have a diagnosis and don't have suspicion and are not making any inquiry. So let's get on to our objectives. So today, I hope that you'll come away with a better understanding of the meaning of neurodiversity, and also with a better understanding of the legal position and risks associated with how to manage these issues. So first of all, what is neurodiversity? And again, this is a slide I could sort of spend an awful lot of time on that we don't have today. So again, just in terms of a whistle-stop tour, neurodiversity is an umbrella term for all of the conditions listed on the slide. So first off, autism, so that's autism spectrum disorder, also known as ASD, and that is a neurological and developmental disorder that affects how people interact with others, how they communicate, how they learn, how they behave, and there is a variety in the type and severity of symptoms that people experience. It can be very sensory seeking, that you're looking for sensations and stimulation, but it can be very sensory avoidant as well, that you are overly sensitive to noise, light, other external stimulation and things like that. And again, I think perhaps the key thing to take away maybe from this slide is that whatever somebody's neurological condition might be, it may well manifest itself very differently from individual to individual. So even if you do have personal or other professional experience of one or more of these conditions, again, the person in front of you presenting with that condition may not present in a way that you are used to or expect. So I think it's also a key thing to try and avoid stereotyping and trying to avoid assumptions as well. So autism, as I say, can include becoming upset by slight changes in routine and perhaps having difficulty with transitions. Again, being more or less sensitive than other people to sensory inputs such as light, sound, clothing or temperature. It's obviously key to think about in an office environment, which might be very busy, very loud, fluctuating temperatures. It can also go hand in hand with other physical conditions. So 30% of people will have epilepsy and gastrointestinal problems. That affects around 9% to 70% of people, and sleep disorders as well. So again, perhaps you might get quite an innocuous footnote from somebody who is autistic. You know, perhaps would say stomach upset, perhaps might say disturbed sleep, and you might not be thinking that this is anything which would ring any bells, that there's something more serious going on, or it is caused by an underlying condition. And again, probably best to take a more interrogative view, is that there might be, the causative issue might be the neurodiverse condition. They also have a risk of burnout through chronic exhaustion and loss of skills and reduced tolerance to stimulus from masking and trying to keep up all the time. And again, in terms of strengths, again, often have very good concentration and, as I've said, very reliable, persistent and accurate. ADHD is an ongoing pattern of inattention and or hyperactivity, impulsivity that interferes with functioning or development. And it can be sort of, as I say, very, very overstimulated or very, very inattentive, or a mixture of a cycle of those two things. And a person with ADHD might find it hard to follow through on instructions, to concentrate and get all the way through to the end of a task. They might find it very easy to get distracted and lose focus and get on with something else. But equally, they can also have periods of very, very intense hyperfocus where they are concentrated on that one thing to the detriment of everything else around them. It can sometimes also mean having difficulty with organising tasks and activities, doing things in a sequence, keeping materials and belongings in order, managing time as well. They might not have a good concept of how long things might take them to do, and might try and overdo things or cram lots of things into a short period of time, which just aren't possible. They might lose things which are necessary for tasks and activities, but again, as I say, it can be very productive in the right mindset, particularly in those periods of hyperfocus. Dyslexia is probably the most common and probably the most, the condition we are the most used to, I think, in dealing with in the workplace. And again, this is a learning difficulty that primarily affects the skills involved in accurate and fluent word reading and spelling. And that can be difficulties interpreting sound, difficulties in language, and it also affects verbal memory and verbal processing speed, and it can also affect short-term memory as well. So again, in terms of processing and instruction you might give an employee that day, they might not have retained that to then carry it forward to take the task through. So again, probably one of those conditions as well where it's best to avoid stereotypical assumptions that it's just bad spelling. It can indeed be quite a lot more than that. And again, can occur alongside other conditions. And again, often there are very, very many strengths that go alongside that, such as creative thinking, and having a different way of looking at the world than somebody else. We've then got dyscalculia, and that is to do with sort of specific and persistent difficulty in understanding numbers. So they might frequently get them wrong, again, not able to quantify and read them properly. Dyspraxia is a condition affecting fine or gross motor coordination, and again, that can frequently co-occur with other neurodiverse conditions. And dysgraphia, and that is where writing standards, the skills are sort of below the standard age or developmental standard that is expected. And that can also sort of lend themselves to difficulties sort of translating thoughts into written word. And again, poor fine motor skills as well for that kind of holding the pen and writing. Tourette's as well, slightly well known, but again, I would sort of say in a slightly stereotyped way that you think of, stereotypically people who have tics will often swear. That is not really the experience of the majority of people who do have Tourette's. It's, again, a wide spectrum of symptoms and behaviours, and it can cause sudden and unwanted repeated movements or vocal sounds, which, as I say, are called tics. Okay, so how does this apply in a legal framework and thinking about what we know? Well, none of those conditions automatically meet the legal definition of disability, and that's in the box on the left on the slide. And the legal definition of disability, according to the Equality Act, is a physical or mental impairment, and that impairment has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on the ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. And somebody who has a neurodiverse condition, if they're going to rely on the protections that the Equality Act gives, in the box on the right, are going to have to show that the way that their condition manifests for them fits this definition. And in all likelihood, most people will be able to do that. Obviously these conditions are incurable, they are there to be managed, so that's the long-term element of the definition. And the adverse effect on day-to-day activities can be, the effect of medication. How might an ADHD person focus and carry out their day-to-day tasks if, for example, you took their crutch away, which might be their medication, to sort of control racing thoughts and things like that. I think the effect, it has to be quite clinical. There has to be a really severe impact on your day-to-day activities. And again, if you're thinking all the time about masking and avoidance of certain activities, avoidance of certain stimulus, avoidance of, occasions which are too stimulating, like networking events, for example, that might be the sufficient impact on your normal day-to-day activities. So what does that kind of mean in terms of protection and what claims an employee might bring at tribunal? Well, if they meet that definition, they are protected from direct discriminations, that is less favourable treatment because of a disability. So say, for example, you only hired candidates who are not neurodiverse. Indirect can be where an employer applies a provision, criterion or practice which perhaps has a disproportionate effect on somebody who does have a protected characteristic. So, for example, you introduced a rule that applied to the whole workforce, but actually it was more difficult for somebody with that protected characteristic to comply with. So a requirement for networking somebody with social difficulties caused by a neurodiverse condition to network frequently with clients. That might be something you apply to all the workforce and expect them to go out and do it and be your representatives, but it's just that much more time, energy, effort, and cost to a neurodiverse person to potentially be complying with that rule. Harassment is behaviour which is offensive, frightening or in any way distressing, and the legal definition for the purposes of a claim is unwanted conduct which has the purpose or effect of creating a hostile and intimidating environment at work. So again, you might have unpleasant behaviour, might be directed towards neurodiverse employees, othering, picking up on aspects of their conditions and penalising them or ridiculing them for that would fall within that definition. It could include name calling, shouting, undermining, belittling, intimidation, exclusion, jokes, all of those kinds of things. We've then got victimisation. So that's subjecting someone to a detriment because they've made a complaint or supporting somebody else's complaint about discrimination. So that might be, again, engaging sort of payback behaviour for somebody who's made a complaint, who supported somebody else to do that, so that you're perhaps excluding them from a certain activity, for example. And then I think the key one really here, which is perhaps again one to take away with you, is the duty and obligation to make reasonable adjustments, and the employee will have a claim for a failure to make reasonable adjustments if we don't put things in place to assist. So again, for example, that might be adapting your job interview processes for a candidate that might find sort of written exercises more difficult due to their dyslexia. Likewise, we also have another special category of discrimination protection for disability as a protected characteristic, which is again discrimination arising from disability, and that is where an individual has a protected characteristic and we're penalising for something arising from that. So again, perhaps somebody's absent for side effects caused by medication that they're taking to manage a neurodiverse condition. Perhaps that medication has side effects like the need to toilet quite frequently, and we're penalising them for time spent away from their desk and time spent away from work. So there's sort of a causal link, but it's not quite as direct as direct discrimination with that type of discrimination. Okay. Here we go. So what can we do to support neurodivergent employees at work? And again, I could go into lots more detail to be very, very condition specific about this. But I would say first and foremost, if you can get a medical report, or if the employee is willing to give it to you, if they do have a statement from school, if that is fairly current and up to date and not a huge amount of changes have gone on, that might be a useful starting block to sort of have a degree of medical understanding as to, right, what condition does this employee have? How does it manifest itself for them? And then applying that to, well, what difficulties might that cause at work for them, and how do we work around that? You will always need a consent for an employee to seek a medical report, and you should be asking questions about what their condition is, how does it particularly affect them, what in particular might help them at work, and perhaps giving an illustrative example or a job description, to sort of set out what it is that they're expected to do to assist the occupational health provider to best assess the situation. And again, try and avoid making stereotypical assumptions about what people can and can't do. And likewise, as I say, you might want to ask them to supply any existing school statement of special educational needs as well. Some occupational health providers do have neurodivergent specialisms, but not all. So again, it might be good to speak to your existing provider if you have one, or to shop around if they don't have that necessary specialism, to try and find someone that does, to perhaps get the best report possible. But likewise, if you're sort of dealing with somebody who suspects they might be neurodiverse but don't have a firm condition yet, it's obviously quite a long process to wait for that diagnosis. That might be something you might consider assisting an employee with, and it might be something that they're seeking privately on their own, for speed reasons, etc. Do you think about dress codes? Again, how does the neurodiverse condition manifest itself? You might make a reasonable adjustment to relax a dress code, for example, for an autistic employee, or adapt uniform requirements where certain textures might be uncomfortable, overstimulating, and causing bother and difficulties concentrating. Working environment is also a big one as well. You sort of think about a busy office-based environment. We've had our example of office noise already this morning. That might be too sensory. That might be too triggering, and somebody might well need a quiet space where they can kind of decompress and calm down and get away from that. Or you might want to think about, again, measures like noise cancelling headphones. Locating people away from the noisy aircon, or the busy thoroughfare, or the bright light coming in from the window, and giving that a little bit of thought. You might also perhaps permit wearing of sunglasses or noise cancelling headphones. And you might also allow for hybrid working, again, if that applies to your workplace and can be, a workaround for the type of job that this individual does, to perhaps again allow the employee a greater chance to work in a comfortable environment. And again, it might also help with sort of the things that go along with these conditions. If again an employee's got gastro issues, it might be more comfortable for them to work from home, being near their own toilet rather than in the office and having to travel to work in that condition as well. You might already have a clear desk policy for good security and confidentiality reasons, and that might also might well work again for people who don't want a messy environment in which to work, which causes noise to them and distraction, etc. Thinking about adjustments to roles and duties, and I think I'd try and encourage people to come at this kind of conversation from a position of concentrating on the employee's strengths. What are they really good at? Why have they got the job with you in the first place? What are their talents and skills? And is it possible to orientate them more to those doing those things than the things that they might find really difficult because of their condition? And also to avoid duties which are causing undue stress, and again, that's impacting the ability to function. Again, flexible working hours might overcome issues with lateness and organisation. So again, that might be helpful for ADHD. And again, I've got a client who has sort of a staggered start time for an employee with ADHD. If they're on a good day, they'll get in on time. If they've on a bad day, they've got about half an hour of grace before we expect them in. Do they perhaps need assistive technology? And again, this might be helpful just for dyslexic people: screen readers, scanning pens, text-to-speech software if typing is a problem, spell checking, things like that. That might be, again, something quite simple and quite reasonable and quite cost effective to have a think about. And likewise, things like providing hard copy documents on coloured paper, and finding out which shade is best, or providing, I think, plastic sort of filters for screens and things like that may also be quite useful. And again, use of coloured shades as well. Management, I think, is a really key thing, and it kind of bleeds into adjustments to roles and duties as well. I think a lot of the things that a neurodiverse employee might well need are things that are about behaviour and how people work and how best to instruct them, how best to manage them, how best to communicate with them. Things that don't really require a lot of cost, but just require a bit of thought and a bit of pause. And I think that's kind of where the direction of travel is likely going to be, that, when we're talking about reasonable adjustments that a tribunal will consider what an employer should or shouldn't have done, they'll be looking at the size and resources of that employer. They'll be looking at how reasonable the adjustment is. Does it actually help the employee? What's the cost of it? Is it reasonable for the employer to bear that cost versus the benefit the employer will get? And as I say, size and resources of the employer are important. But if it is a question of, right, actually, we just need to slightly change our management style, which, as I say, has no cost to the organisation, but just perhaps a bit of time and thought behind it, it might well be very easy for an employee to effectively argue that you could have done that with little or no cost to you and just a bit of thought, and that is a successful reasonable adjustments claim. So in terms of management, try and think about the best way to give instructions. That might be best to give in writing for certain people, but writing may be an absolute no-no for others. It might be best to give things at the beginning of the day when somebody is refreshed and is more likely to be able to take that in, and their processing faculties are good, and also to allow the employee time to try and absorb those instructions and effectively plan. Think about using format other than text, so videos, drawings, diagrams, flowcharts. Spell out numbers, provide access to a calculator and a digital clock. Again, all quite easy, or probably on your laptop screen as you're looking, if you're at your desk this morning already. Use of speech recognition, spell checking programs, as I've mentioned. Use of timers. It could go one of two ways, couldn't it? That might be an undue stress for an employee, so that's perhaps something to think about, and only introduce with the employee's agreement to see how that works. Flexibility, as I say, trying to build in flexibility. It is again something I've been discussing with clients, again, having an employee very wedded to a process, but when there are legitimate reasons to depart from that process, almost building in a function for that employee or a thought process or a mind map for them to go, right, number one, this is the rule, we follow original process, but number two, if we for some reason can't follow that original process, this is the process you follow, this is the alternative process for the exceptions, and if all that fails, you come and speak to so-and-so, your line manager, or other designated person who's in charge of that process. So we give that employee 3 options to follow and 3 routes, and that little bit of structure, again, might help them and might, again, try and reduce that conflict they might have with team members who are going, but we can always depart from this policy, we've done it before, why is there a resistance here? Again, be thinking about sickness absence processes and be alert to that physical issues, again, might be caused by a neurodiverse condition, as I've said. And you might, again, need absences like home working, adjusting sickness absence management triggers, etc., to kind of discount absences which are linked to the neurodiverse condition. Likewise, regular breaks and a change of environment might assist productivity and focus, but again, possibly not for everybody, depending on their condition. I think this is another key one as well. It depends on how good your relationship with the employee is, about discussing and agreeing whether they want to be open with their condition or not. And again, you might sort of see a bit of a generational divide here. Certain junior staff members who might recently have come from school, might be quite open about their condition because that's how things were at school for them, and they're quite happy to discuss it and have other employees to be aware of it. Other people might be more reticent, but I think there is a case perhaps to make to a resident employee that there perhaps is a good idea to have some people know on a need to know basis that they can go to if they've got a problem and who perhaps understand the background, or again can perhaps diffuse any conflict situations with that bit of additional knowledge, or again have imparted to the medical report and the adjustments we've agreed to make sure that those adjustments aren't rowed back by somebody who doesn't necessarily know what the adjustment is and why it's there. That might again give confidence, make sure we're acting consistently, and that change that we are making are being honoured, and kept to throughout that time. So tricky issues, employer knowledge. For any disability discrimination claim in the employment tribunal, the claimant has got to establish that the employer had knowledge of their condition. And that's either actual knowledge, i.e. I've told you, I put it on my pre-employment medical questionnaire, I told my line manager, those kind of things, but constructive knowledge as well, which is actually, there are enough signs there that the employer ought to have been on inquiry and ought to have been asking questions. And again, I think this is a really, really tricky issue in this area because of, again, sort of cohort of people who might have been diagnosed at school and are just going into the workforce, and again, may well be communicating the very clear knowledge that they're neurodiverse. And again, there's perhaps longer term section of employees who might just be coming to that real isolation themselves, or indeed, again, I've had an issue with a client whereby the type of work that client does mean that they are with clinical issues, that they do have a degree more specialist knowledge than you'd expect of a normal employer. And the advice I've kind of given to them is going to be, I think you would be subject to a high threshold here. So they have their suspicions that somebody is neurodiverse, but that has not come from that person. That person is not aware that they might be, has made no suggestion that they are looking into it. And indeed, we don't think that that is something that employee is considering. And again, it's that tricky issue of, do we sit down and do we tell the employee what our suspicions are? I think it's a really, really invidious position for employers to be in, and you might well not feel confident enough in having that conversation because fundamentally the majority of us are not clinicians, we're not able to diagnose. You might all have personal experience which you bring to bear and go, hang on a minute, that looks or feels or sounds a little bit like it might be neurodiversity, but are we ultimately ever sure? There was a very interesting tribunal case decided last year about knowledge. It was a chap who worked for a large high street bank. He had been there for a number of years and then left of his own volition, went and did other things. and then had a period where he was reapplying to get back into work at this bank, and he was rejected every time. He was unsuccessful in all of those attempts. And he brought a tribunal claim for disability discrimination. He had not had his ASD diagnosis at the point at which he was in his past employment with the bank. But he alleged that they discriminated against him in this new recruitment application because they ought to have known that he was neurodiverse. He had in fact secured a diagnosis in that interim period between him leaving the bank and him starting to apply for work to return to them. And the tribunal said, well, he sort of said, well, they ought to have known, they ought to have seen that I had difficulty with socialising and I was a bit direct. They ought to have been on inquiry that these might be aspects of neurodiversity, this might be ASD. And what the tribunal found was actually that wasn't a sufficient threshold for the employer to be on inquiry. And even if they had gone and they'd asked, that at that point in time, he would have probably been obstructive. Again, I think that's quite a tricky decision. Based on the fact pattern, and it might have gone a different way had perhaps the employee been very open about the suspicions that they might have neurodiversity. I suspect this is all slightly comes down to the personality of the claimant as to why that decision's been made. But again, it's probably one of those, again, do you broach that subject or do you not? Or again, what I've done with that client in the end is that we thought actually we don't have a good enough relationship to broach this with the employee. But what we will do is we will try and tick the box of reasonable adjustments anyway. We will have regular sit downs with this employee. We will ask if there's anything that they need support with at work, and we will try and identify those little difficulties causing conflict and work around them. So we are ticking the box, even if we don't necessarily broach it directly with that employee, we're trying to manage it in that way. So, yep, that's probably covered employer knowledge, no diagnosis unaware, and self-diagnosed as well is a tricky one. You don't need an official diagnosis to bring a claim of disability discrimination at tribunal. It is enough that whatever physical or mental impairment you have ticks the different elements of that definition. But again, I sort of see again in our day-to-day practice an increase of people who reckon that they are neurodiverse, either just of their own volition, their own reading, or again, it might be that a family member has got a firm diagnosis and they're extrapolating from that. Again, if you were going to an employment tribunal as a claimant, you would expect some sort of medical evidence to back that up, even if it is not a firm diagnosis, i.e. that they have been to their GP and discussed aspects of their day-to-day life that are finding difficult, or they have provided a sworn witness statement about the aspects of their day-to-day life which are affected by neurodiversity that they believe. So you don't need to have a firm diagnosis, but it would obviously help when you'd be in a stronger position to bring a claim if you did. But yeah, again, that's something to be aware of and not to discount just because somebody doesn't necessarily have a statement or a diagnosis quite yet. I think another tricky area is the perception of neurodiversity. Discrimination can also arise where there's perception that somebody's neurodiverse, but they might not be. That can usually arise again in cases of harassment, again, making stereotypical assumptions and derogatory comments targeting somebody because of the perception they might be neurodiverse. And again, do bear in mind, the person who can bring a discrimination claim does not have to have the protected characteristic, which is so again, I'd also sort of extend that warning to be aware that, you might have colleagues who are not neurodiverse themselves, but might have neurodiverse friends and family members and have a connection or an association there. And again, that might lead to rise of claims for offensive behaviour. And again, in the context of, we've obviously got a big employment rights bill coming through Parliament at the minute. I think it's currently in the Lords. We are tightening up discrimination protections anyway for third-party harassment. That is going to be a big thing this year. This will fall squarely within that as a type of third-party harassment. If you have clients, behaving inappropriately to colleagues, or as I say, colleagues who are making complaints about other colleagues' behaviour, that's again something that needs to be managed, and again something that you might well be looking at in the context of your general compliance, reminding people what the standards of behaviour you expect from them. And again, I've had a certain amount of work recently with people wanting to impose good conduct policies and trained staff for sort of setting a baseline for what we minimum expect for good behaviour. Colleague knowledge is another tricky one. And I suppose that comes back to employer knowledge as well. And again, I have had instances where an employee has confided to a colleague that they are neurodiverse, but they have not officially said that to the employer. Again, for the purposes of actual knowledge at tribunal, you are imputed to have the knowledge that your employees have. We've also had tricky scenarios where somebody's reported neurodiversity to a colleague, not spoken directly to us about it, and that colleague has then reported it to the employer. And again, tricky situation for the employer, because you might not be entirely comfortable that this information's ended up with you, and that person who's originally disclosed the information might well have told it to that colleague in confidence, not intending for it to get back to you. Again, I don't think in those kind of scenarios you can ignore what you know what you know. And again, how we're managing scenarios like that, again, is that you might well ask the employee if there's anything that they think that we need to know about them at work that might be relevant to how we can help support them, etc. But otherwise, I just think you check in and again, make an assumption that, yep, we think you are because we know, and let's have a discussion with you about how best we can support you at work, even if that's not directly bringing up what we think we know about your condition. Do be aware as well that from a data protection point of view, obviously all medical information is special category personal data, and it can't be processed or disclosed without at least 2 legal grounds to do so, and one of those is normally the individual's consent. So as I say, I think it's kind of come up in sort of that need to know basis, and speaking to line managers and kind of letting certain people in the organisation know it's down to the employees to how comfortable or not they are with that, and do just be aware of the data protection element there as well. Disciplinary and performance management. This is again another really, really tricky area, because you might well have some challenging behaviour, and to what extent is that caused by a neurodivergent condition, or that somebody has said something out of line, which perhaps they are impulsive and didn't think it through, and that's a hallmark of ASD or ADHD. They've caused offence, we've got a complaint, we've got a grievance, and again, in ordinary circumstances, you might have disciplined that employee for that conduct or that language, or the incident that's happened. It's such a fact sensitive area, and again the tribunals have been considering this. One particularly prominent case was an employee who had an altercation with their line manager, a bit of a shouting match. They had a lot of reasonable adjustments in place to manage their autism and aspects of their autism that were difficulty. And he was saying, well, the reason I sort of got into this altercation with my line manager, which was why he was eventually dismissed and brought his unfair dismissal claim, brought his disability discrimination claims, was because, I was frustrated that my adjustments weren't being abided by, or I think there was some sort of adjustment around meetings that had sort of fallen through or hadn't been communicated on one occasion, hence this to do with the line manager. The tribunal found that that was not disability discrimination. They sort of really clearly did quite a in-depth character assessment of this individual and decided he was quite a bad-tempered and short-tempered employee in any event, and that was not connected to his neurodiverse condition. But again, you could see on a different fact pattern with a different employee with a different manifestation of condition on a different day, that might have gone very differently. I'm not suggesting that it's a pass to sort of accept all bad behaviour. It certainly isn't. And I would certainly say that many people who are neurodiverse have a very strict idea of what's right and what's wrong, and they know how to behave themselves and conduct themselves appropriately at work. And it just might be, again, be a matter of providing support, but also, you shouldn't necessarily be afraid to discipline performance management when you need to. But again, you might need to think about the ways in which that individual might need to be managed and additional support they might need through that process, and also going forward in terms of we don't want to repeat this conduct again. And again, just having a think about the things that you might ordinarily sanction as part of performance or disciplinary, again, might have that underlying root cause of something which is neurodiverse. So again, thinking back to the conditions we discussed, lack of organisation and attention to detail as hallmarks of ADHD might well be something you'd ordinarily performance manage and sanction, but might need a different tack with reasonable adjustments. And the risk of those kind of sanctions for somebody who's got that kind of condition, if that issue is something directly caused by that condition, is that it can lead to discrimination arising from disability or failure to make adjustments. And there's just a couple of resources here in neurodiversity. There's some excellent sort of neurodiversity resources on the ACAS website, which is always my first port of call generally for employment issues. As we are in Neurodiversity Celebration Week, there's their website up there. This is only a very small selection of the kind of resources that are out there. There's all sorts of books and additional reading that you can do. And as I say, if you want additional support for management, that is something that I can support, and come and have a chat with me. But otherwise, that's all I've got to say this morning. Thanks very much for listening. And if anybody's got any questions, that would be great. Pop them in the Q&A chat, and I'll do my best. I can copy the list of resources to the chat, or Mo will be circulating. Hi Mo, nice to see you. Circulating slides at the end to all attendees as well. Yeah, we will. Lorraine will have a recirculation recording as well. That's absolutely fine. Oh yes, experience cases where line manager and team manager are both neurodiverse and how does this manifest? With difficulty, I think, because again, how it's come across, there's sort of a bit of a skewed sample here because I often get involved in cases where there's been conflict. So I sort of perhaps have a slightly skewed view of or a skewed experience perhaps, but I've certainly come across situations where perhaps a line manager is neurodiverse in one way, that they might be very, very organised, very regimented in how they do things, but another colleague might be neurodiverse in a different way and they are more scattered and disorganised. You know, again, I think it's going to come down to the relationship between the two and how you manage that. And I wonder whether, you know, where there is conflict arising from people's completely different ways of doing things, that perhaps that might be a matter of shared understanding. It might be a matter of mediation between employees. It might be a matter where you try and get all parties together to agree some ground rules that so-and-so can work in perhaps their disorganised way on these things, but on certain things where they're working together or carrying out projects, we do need these milestones to be set. And again, that might come back to reasonable adjustments, and perhaps again, if they're both willing to sort of explain their conditions to each other, that might lend itself to a bit more additional understanding, if you like, of different things. You know, hopefully a bit of grace and patience. But yeah, it's a really, really tricky area, I think, to manage what might be two very difficult and competing characteristics really in neurodiverse bits and pieces. Okay. Oh, sorry, Mike. That question was, have you experienced any cases where line management team member are both neurodiverse and how does that manifest? Next question is, how do you determine whether an adjustment is reasonable or not? As I say, that's going to come down to whether it actually helps the employee. If it's going to help them overcome a significant hurdle, i.e. having spell check is going to hugely you know, improve the quality of their written communication because they're dyslexic, and it is not very expensive to put into place, that is probably going to be reasonable for, you know, most employees of most of a size. More will be expected of a larger employer with greater resources, a bigger HR team, bigger coffers. But again, you've still got to come back to, is this helping the employee? Perhaps, you know, give an example which is not to do with neurodiversity, which is, you know, if you've got a back problem, but you want a floating desk, you've got to show that that floating desk is going to help that problem, not because it's just a nice thing to have and you can move about a little bit more. You've got to actively be showing what the barrier is which is being overcome. But as I say, I think coming back to sort of the neurodiversity context, a lot of things, if they are to do with how you talk to your employee, how you deliver tasks, how you set things out for them, are not going to have any cost attached to them at all. It's going to be just a bit of management time and thought in sort of delivering that and changing your ways of working. Okay. Oh, good question from Sophia. Difficult balance when looking at these things regarding organisation, attention to detail, and making sure you're not being discriminatory. Do you have any examples of good practice or innovative approaches to helping neurodiverse or divergent employees satisfy minimum requirements for delivering on their responsibilities? Oh, I think this is going to, again, hugely depend on what condition the employee has and how it manifests itself, and also what the job is. If there are certain aspects of the job that they're finding difficult, that's kind of thing where you first need to look at reasonable adjustments and sitting down with them, having a dialogue. And I think a lot of the advice I'm giving kind of comes down to trying to build a really good relationship of trust with the employee, that they're happy to come to you with things, they're happy to talk about their condition to you, and you can kind of use that knowledge to try and best help them and to try and apply it to kind of overcome those barriers. In terms of good practice, I think setting clear rules. You might want to have a policy in place about neurodivergent employees to try and encourage people to come forward and have those chats with you and talk about the support that you might give. Innovative approaches, I think everybody's still learning. I certainly am. in terms of delivering responsibilities, I think it's going to be about how best you communicate with that employee, what works best for them, and trying to work and fit around them to communicate that clearly. And that might well be you're not overloading them with all those responsibilities at once, that actually we've got 2 tasks for today. I want you to do this task in the morning and this task in the afternoon. Perhaps you might revisit in the afternoon just to go, just by way of reminder, this is what we're doing this afternoon, here's the resources, what we need to help, and just kind of checking in really, which again probably requires a little bit more time than a hands-off line manager might ordinarily give or want to give. But again, I think it's about being flexible. But again, the specifics are really going to come down to what an individual employee wants. Okay. Carolyn Barnett. We have 4 ADHD colleagues working in the childcare industry who regularly have outbursts of swearing and telling clients to shut up, yet have reasonable adjustment to the ground rules, however choose not to take themselves out of the situation. Any advice on this? Again, going to depend on how the ADHD manifests itself. Obviously, there is a degree of impulsivity in that as a generic condition. There is an issue, isn't there? And this is often where discrimination gets really tricky, is conflict between different obligations that you have to different people. So I think obviously the most obvious thing is that in a childcare setting, swearing and shouting and modelling poor behaviour is clearly going to have an impact on the kids who might witness or overhear that behaviour. And likewise, there might also be health and safety issues, arising from bad behaviour. And that clash between, well, if that bad behaviour is caused by the neurodiverse issue or exacerbated by the neurodiverse issue, how do we manage it? But we've also got our obligations as well. And I think that's a real sticky issue. I think you've just got to be consistent. As I say, it will depend on what the employee's manifestation of neurodiverse is, and if this is part and parcel of their condition, it might not be part and parcel of it for all of them. And as I say, if they got to tribunal stage endgame, they'd have to show that it was. That burden of evidence would be on them. I would perhaps kind of take the view that we want to prioritise the well-being of the kids you're looking after in that environment, and if they are, particularly if what they're doing does constitute a safeguarding issue, I would sort of try and prioritise your health and safety and safeguarding issues in those circumstances. So, perhaps the first initial issue is that we talk to the employees about coping strategies, which it sounds like you've done. That there are alternatives to having a go at your colleagues, which are walking away, diffusing the situation, going to speak to your line manager. In fact, as you might advise any other employee to do, whether or not they're neurodiverse, come out of that escalating situation and don't react. And perhaps it's about giving practice and helping them with those coping mechanisms, helping them put in place. But I think there's also a point at which, if that's not working, you might want to take the risk and go down the disciplinary route with some sanctions to see if that doesn't work as well, to sort of motivate people. But not without risk, as I say, if somebody can show that impulsivity is caused by the neurodiverse condition. Okay. Are you seeing much more success for unfair dismissal claims for performance issues where the claimant suggests they haven't received sufficient support or adjustments from their employer? Not in necessarily unfair dismissal claims. There's quite a lot of recent case law. In fact, I've got 2 slides worth, I think, in this extended talk for failure to make reasonable adjustments claims that have been decided recently for different employees of different sort of neurodiverse issues, one of which was sort of application processes and things like that. So I wouldn't necessarily say I see more success in unfair dismissal claims. It's more an argument which lends itself to disability discrimination, but very often, if you've got a long-term employee who is neurodiverse, they're bringing both claims. So one sort of begets the other, the discrimination and unfair dismissal. But yeah, certainly it's an area where we're seeing a growth issue. And obviously, if you're trying to fairly dismiss for performance reasons, you will always look at ways in which you can try and support the employee to be better. It's just if that person does meet that definition of disability, you've got that higher threshold for the reasonable adjustments issue as part of that. So yeah, I can see it just go hand in hand. Yeah. Okay. So I am an AUDHD employee. I'm usually highly organised and successful, but I'm in a business where I'm one of a few remote individuals, and the lack of awareness generally on remote employee challenges makes it hard for me to manage the neurodivergent characteristics is it takes up more of my energy. I don't feel I should need to rely on reasonable adjustments to get what I need when these should be a business standard. And I feel this puts me at risk of future discrimination. How would you approach this? I mean, certainly tactically, I would try and get, if you've not done so already, I would try and sort of have a conversation or start an email chain and prepare some correspondence which discloses that you have your conditions and how those manifest and how your remote home working helps that. Because at the very least then you've got sort of disclosable evidence that your employer had the knowledge that you did have this, and there were issues and that you were able to manage those issues and those difficulties with those adjustments like the hybrid working and working from home, etc. And that you're creating that direct link between the two things and that evidential chain. If you can get support from a GP or other clinical practitioner to sort of recommend those, there's nothing stopping you from getting your own medical evidence. You don't have to wait for your employer to send you to occupational health. You can rely on what support you might be receiving already, or as I say, going to your GP and asking them to write you a letter, or going to your specialist and asking for them to do a report for you, which you can then disclose to your employer. In terms of sort of the lack of awareness on remote employee challenges, I think that's down to you as to how comfortable you feel about disclosing that condition to the wider, someone said public, that's not the right word, your wider colleagues other than just the sort of need to know employees like a line manager, etc. There is also some tactical benefit if people are giving you a hard time for working from home. If there is a unfair perception that you're not working as effectively as you could do because you're not in the office alongside everybody else, then I think that's, again, tactically you might want to take the view that you report that again to your line manager, again create a paper trail. If it's quite serious, you might go as far as raising a grievance about that, and again you might well be sort of, if things did go wrong, you're giving the employer the opportunity to put stuff right, first of all, and you hope that they do. But if stuff does go wrong, you do have the opportunity to sort of create correspondence, create a paper trail as to what's gone on, and particularly be thinking about trying to create protections for yourself, like protection from victimisation, i.e. I have complained about my colleague basically calling me a malingerer the other day. They might not know the reasons why you've got your particular working from home adjustments in place, but if your employer does know why and they don't take action to deal with that, then that's clearly a problem. And again, I'd perhaps suggest again for other people still sort of listening, thank you very much, from the employer side of things, if you are getting reports from colleagues who are neurodiverse that they are on the receiving end of comments like this, I think it is very much a zero tolerance. You might not necessarily tell people why that's not acceptable if the colleague is not comfortable in sharing their condition, but certainly you shouldn't be tolerating, behaviour that could constitute discrimination in the workplace. That is going to result in a claim. So for anonymous attendees' point of view, I'd be trying to create that paper trail just in case things went wrong and you did have to get out, that might give you a negotiated position if you wanted an exit package, if the environment weren't working for you anymore and you wanted to find someone else who best supported you. But as I say, I hope that's not the case. I hope that's a worst case scenario. I hope you'd feel confident enough to try and have a chat with your employer and try and put things right. And equally, if that's taking up time and energy, are there discussions you might need to be having about, flexible working to stave off burnout and things like that, before they happen. But yeah, I think you can only do your best, and I appreciate it's a really tricky situation, and particularly if you don't really want to discuss your condition too much, but tricky. Okay. Another question, what if a reasonable adjustment goes against company policy? For example, one employee, ADHD, likes to CF 2 to 3 days annual leave from December, typically busy work month, to take the first few days of January instead. Carry forward. Less busy, also wanted to buy a number of annual leave holidays in that year allowed per policy, but company policy is the amount of annual leave where you can buy reduced annual leave. Reduced carry forward. Would this be a reasonable adjustment? Employees rigidly thinking he needs time off over Christmas and New Year, but will not take New Year's annual leave, so he wants to keep some back as a safety net for other annual leave breaks, etc. Again, I think we come back to, well, there might be some indirect discrimination here, i.e. employers' policy is this is what you do with your holiday leave, let's carry forward, carry back, and not booking times off at particular times of year, etc., etc. It might be a question of organisation, that the employer does have some flexibility at those times, but only on a first come, first served basis, and you've got to be at the front of that queue if that's what you want. I think the effectiveness of any argument about reasonable adjustments for taking holiday has again got to be how you link it to your condition. It's got to be more than just a preference for a time off at that time of year. And I think that would be where the difficulty would be, that it's not necessarily a condition of the neurodiverse condition that you have to have time off at Christmas. It's got to be why is it linked to the condition and the difficulties that surround it. It's all right. Why that time of year rather than time off at any other time? That's a lot of really good questions. Anybody got any more before we go? No worries, thanks, Mo. Nice to see you. As I say, learned a lot from you as well in your talks, which were absolutely fabulous. Mo also, for the attendees on the call, is a specialist in this area too. So no worries. Thank you, Emma. Thank you for coming. Lovely. If that's everybody and everything, thank you all very, very much for coming. Enjoy the rest of Neurodiversity Celebration Week. If anybody has any other tricky issues, then you can find me on the Higgs website. My email, my phone number is there. I'm happy to talk to employees about any tricky issues they might be having at work. And as I say, if anybody would like to sort of take the lessons of this recording back to the organisation, or again, perhaps want some more detailed management training on sort of the legalities of disability discrimination and what to look out for and what to avoid, then I would really be very happy to help. Please let me know. All right, thank you so much, everybody. Thanks, Sophia. Thanks, Justine, and I'll stop the share and let you go. Thanks all. Have a good week.